typically age 65. They'd get their gold watch from their company after working 40 years there. They would have a retirement party, and they would go home, sit on the couch, and their dutiful wife would care for them for the next 5 years, and then they would pass on to their final reward, as their ministers would. And that's the heart of what we're talking about here, is what do we do that's different than the way it used to be. First of all, it's not that way anymore. Most companies don't want people hanging around for 40 years, so it's not usual for people to have the same career for 40 years even, much less the same company. Retirement parties are a thing of the past. Gold watches don't happen anymore. Worst of it, they go home and the dutiful wife is not there because she has a career of her own, so she's not interested in. But this came about when Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 signed the precursor to our Social Security Act. They figured that most people would retire at 65 and die at 70. So it was right on at that time, and it was that way for many years. But now it's not that way anymore. So what we want to do is look at, Yogi said again, so at this stage in our life, our attention shifts from the length of life. And the depth of life is this issue that Seligman talked about when he talked about meaning. And that's the question we have to ask ourselves, is what gives us meaning? What makes our life worthwhile? What makes it a life well lived? I went to the memorial service for my mentor, which I mentioned in my first book, Boo Bew. He had an accident when he was 90, fell down, hit his head, and unfortunately, as a result of that accident, he died. But his best friend gave the memorial presentation. He said, I want to call this talk a life well lived, he says, because Boo really had a life well lived. And he was always my mentor, my model, my hero, and I attempted to emulate the things that he was doing as much as possible and feel as though, as a result of that, my life is being well lived. And there are components that go into the life well lived. Let's go back to Seligman again. He talks about this formula he calls PERMA, which is the acronym for the 5 components that go into a life well lived. And I'd like to get your feedback on your response to this. How do you feel about it? He said, number 1 is personal satisfaction. And that is those things that we do just because they feel good when we do them. Could be reading a book, going to a play, could be spending time with family or friends, but it's those things that just enrich us and cause us to feel good as a result of doing them. And it's an important part of our having a life well lived. It's necessary but insufficient, because those people, and I remember interviewing a woman when I was living in Spain, and I was working on the first book, and I said, well, what's the purpose of life? She said, to be happy. I said, yes, and she said, to be happy. And she was very self-indulgent. Her husband and I were in a group together over there. But her whole life was about self-indulgence, in my opinion. Now, there may have been more to her, but I talked to her several times at different meetings, and I couldn't see any depth to her. So I think that being happy is good. I like to be happy. I like to laugh, and I like to enjoy myself. I like to do those things that feel good. But I know that's insufficient. Seligman said also that it is critical that we be engaged. And I was sitting at a meeting with a fellow last week, a week ago Saturday, and we were listening to a speaker who was giving us an important presentation. It was a Rotary meeting on ways in which we could do a better job of promoting our Rotary Club. And I was tuned into what he was saying, I looked over at this fellow, and he had his phone out, and he was reading the news or whatever things he could find on the phone. And it's not the first time I've seen him do that. And I said, well, that's a marvelous negative example I can use in my talk about what not being engaged is. And fortunately, when we come here every Sunday, we don't have to put much effort into being engaged because Donna gives a compelling talk every week. She asked me to say that. So you know what I'm saying about being engaged. Let's just take and let's go to his third one very quickly. He said that relationships are an important part of a life well lived, of well-being. That is our family, our friends, our community members, our fellow parishioners here. These are the people that give our life meaning and a feeling of well-being. So let's take those first three components, and if we were doing a workshop, I'd have handouts and you could write on them, but you'll have to do this in your heads. So of those three things, personal satisfaction, engagement, and relationships,